Pearl is the latest movie put out by horror director Ty West. It's a prequel to the movie that he released earlier this summer called X, and it stars Mia Goth, who also co-wrote the movie with him. Because this movie is a prequel, it's going to be hard to talk about this without at least mentioning X or talking a little bit about X. So I'll do that as I go, and I'll try and keep spoilers out of both films as best as possible. We'll see how well that goes, but I'm going to try and keep spoilers out of both so that I don't ruin either one. But it is important to sort of talk a little bit about X as we get into Pearl. So, as I mentioned, this is a prequel of the Pearl character, which was introduced in the movie X. So the movie X is set in 1979, and it's about a group of young filmmakers who go into rural Texas, show up on an old farm owned by this elderly couple, and they want to film an adult movie. So they've rented out this little shack in the back, and they want to film an adult movie to sell it. Mia Goth plays the lead character in that. The elderly woman in the home is Pearl. This movie, Pearl, is her backstory. So this is also played by Mia Goth, who plays the role of Pearl. This is set in 1918, and it is getting towards the end of World War I, and Pearl is home on her farm with her German overbearing mother and her invalid dad. Her husband is away at war, and so she is kind of left on the farm with her parents. Pearl is someone with her head in the clouds. She has got huge ambitions to become a dancer. And so she wants to be, ever since she was a little, she wanted to be a star and she wanted to be a dancer. And so a lot of her daily activities, she goes along and she is doing this farm work, but she's constantly thinking about how she can kind of get away from this life and become a dancing star. At that time, movies were just kind of coming around, so she goes into town to see the pictures, and she would love to be on screen, but she just wants to be a dancer. And so as she feels like she's being held prisoner on this farm at home, she was hoping that her husband, when she got married, would kind of take her away from all this, but he ended up getting called out to war, and so now she's kind of stuck at home. The movie itself is an interesting thing because I'm going to get into a little bit of semantics here. It's pitched and sold as a horror movie, but realistically, it's not really a horror movie in that sense. It really is just a Greek tragedy. You know where this character ends up because there's a prequel. You know where this character is going to be in 1979. So you know sort of her life trajectory in a general sense. You know how it all plays out. So, juxtapose that with her dreams and ambitions of becoming this great dancer and doing all these great things. You know that's not really going to happen. And so what you're watching is you're watching this young, innocent girl with giant dreams and aspirations, but with a great amount of insecurity and fear. And those emotions lead to some not so good choices and kind of leads her down this darker path. And you're just watching this kind of unfold as this very slow-moving train wreck. So it's this Greek tragedy kind of wrapped in this very simple horror story as a container. And that's kind of amazing. And also a little bit of a shame because had this movie been a straight-up drama, it would get a lot more recognition from an acting and directing standpoint. Because once again, Ty West, and I'm a big Ty West fan, I think he's one of the best writer-directors of horror movies working today. Even though, to be perfectly honest, I don't generally love all of his movies. I think each one of his movies I love for certain reasons, but they're all inherently flawed in some fashion. And so when I say I love Ty West, I want him to continually make movies because I think he's fantastic at it. From a technical sense, his craft is amazing. And what he brings to the screen is incredible, even if the final product is still somewhat flawed. We are better off for seeing that flawed product than for him not to make it at all. So Ty West has done, once again, another great job here. Mia Goth has an amazing performance in this movie where she really is able to ride this line of a character that is deeply flawed, but someone you actually root for, even though you know it's not going to work out. And that's incredible. And Ty, to his credit, really lets her take up the screen. And there are several sort of longer moments in this movie, longer takes, where Mia is just really just knocking it out of the park and having these deep, rich scenes where she has to go through a complicated set of emotions. If this was a drama movie, she would get so much recognition from an award standpoint. But because it's a horror movie and Hollywood hates horror movies, she's not really going to get the recognition that she rightfully deserves for this because, horror movies kind of get a bad rap. Pretentious Hollywood wouldn't recognize a horror movie. I mean, they only recognize horror movies recently because Jordan Peele kind of dragged them kicking and screaming into the horror world. So much so that they wouldn't even recognize it, Get Out, as a horror movie. They had to invent a whole new genre called elevated horror just to sort of alleviate their own minds. Even though elevated horror is a bullshit term, you don't have elevated drama or elevated comedy or elevated action. There is just those. There is just those genres. There isn't no such thing as elevated. It is just as is. But they're so high on their horse that they don't want to recognize horror movies as actual art that people put a lot of effort, time, and discipline in. In that sense, it's a shame that she is not going to get the recognition that she rightfully deserves, but she really opened my eyes as to what she can do. There are no real major twists or surprises. It kind of just it kind of works as you would anticipate, but that actually doesn't matter. It's a joy to watch, and I'm gonna kind of compare that a little bit to X, where with X, I really enjoyed X a lot. I thought one of the things that Ty West does amazingly well is he crafts these characters that are all three-dimensional characters. They're all people that are not black and white. They're all variant shades of gray. Sure, there are characters that are mean, there are characters that are evil, but they're fleshed out in a sense where you understand at least their motivations and where they're coming from. And with X, it's set up as a very simple, straightforward slasher. And it is kind of a straightforward slasher, and somewhat to its detriment where it never actually goes beyond that. And that in X, it kind of works against it. In Pearl, it works for it. Where in X, it needed maybe one more story layer, one more reveal, one more little twist. Because in X, the moment you see and the story that is unfolding, you know exactly what's going to happen, and it doesn't change. It unfolds in the same way that you would expect it to unfold. That happens in Pearl, but with Pearl, because it's a bit more focused on the character and watching her sort of descent into this dark area, you can deal with it a little bit better than with X, where there never is that reveal of, there's no twist involved where you're like, that's something I wasn't expecting, and take the story in a slightly different direction. It doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be M. Night kind of direction where all of a sudden it's all a dream or it's a snow globe or whatever. It just has to maybe shift things a little bit just to throw you off a tad. And with X, it never does that. It stays on the same path that you get right from the very beginning. That's not a terrible thing. It's just at this point, we've seen so many different movies that do so many different things. It just feels a little lacking because of it. However, the strange thing is in Pearl, like I said, it works to its favor, and that actually, it never really comes about as a detriment to the film. You kind of know where it's going because you know that character and you know where that character ends up. But seeing as it unfold and see the sort of turns that are done and the choices that are being made and watching her go through this sort of stripping down of innocence almost is captivating. I thoroughly enjoy this movie. I think if you're looking for a horror movie, a quote unquote horror movie, you're not going to like this movie. If you're going to it to get a bunch of jump scares, if you're going to it because you want to see a bunch of scary things, this movie, you're going to walk away from this movie and you're going to think, oh, that movie wasn't all that good. It was just some girl walking around a farm getting into mischief. That's a little bit of a shame because it's not a horror movie in the sense where it's scary or I mean, there are some graphic moments to it, and so you might walk away thinking that it's not a very good horror movie. But from a movie perspective, it's an excellent movie. You just have to kind of put aside the preconceptions of what a horror movie is. And so I think this movie was fantastic in that way. I would give this movie an A, and just to sort of bookend this with X, I would say I would have given X a B plus. I think X does a lot of things extremely well, but I do think it needed a slight banking, a slight curve of storyline. Whereas Pearl, it stayed along that straight and narrow, but it all kind of worked perfectly. It just works from beginning to end. It is a very slow burn movie. Everything is very methodically paced. It's a shame that he is not as recognized as some of the other horror directors out there, like your Ari Asters or your Jordan Peele's or your Robert Eggers. He's sort of flown under the radar, and I admire him because looking back at his feature directing career, he directed House of the Devil, Innkeepers, The Sacrament, Cabin Fever 2, In the Valley of Violence, and then, of course, X, and now Pearl, and then, of course, there's going to be a third one of this, Maxine, in this trilogy. With the exception of In the Valley of Violence, I think was a $5 million production, and as was Cabin Fever 2, which Cabin Fever 2, I don't even know if that's an accurate number because the amount of production problems that thing had, and he's gone on the record and said that was an awful experience. I wouldn't be surprised if the budget was far, far lower and there's some Hollywood bookkeeping going on there. So I don't know about that. But putting aside those two movies, you could combine House of the Devil, Innkeepers, X, and Pearl, and all four of those movies would fit into the budget of Get Out, which is insane. I think what Ty West has been able to do here with a tiny, tiny fraction of a budget to say what an Ari Aster or a Robert Eggers or a Jordan Peele has got. I mean, this last movie that Jordan Peele did, Nope, was a $70 million movie. From a technical standpoint, I think Ty West, with a fraction of that budget in both X and Pearl, as well as some of his earlier movies, which were under $1 million, run rings around what Jordan Peele does. And it's a shame that he doesn't get quite the recognition that I think that he justly deserves. And I, for one, I'm a big fan. And hopefully this trilogy will do well enough where he can kind of be elevated and get some larger budgets under his belt, because I just think he is one of the best straight up horror writer directors that are out there today. And so I hope he makes more. But anyway, this already went way longer than I wanted. If you can get by the fact that it is not a traditional horror movie, I think you'll enjoy this. I think the performances are just out of this world. Let me know what you think.